Streamlaments. Welcome to my channel. Nightbot. Welcome to my channel.
Let me check this real fast.
Issues that we've had with the PSA crank, not the stuff in.
Ice. Welcome to my channel.
In the United States, more than 90% of people live in counties where the costs of housing have risen more than income over the last 20 years. Housing suppliers failed to keep up with demand, the gap having been widening ever since the early 2000s. Relatedly, the share of 25 to 34-year-olds living with their parents has been climbing, nearly doubling from 10% in 1983 to 19.1% in 2023, and that was even after a sizable post-COVID decline in young people living at home. The stats are little better across the world, with housing having become one of the defining issues of the last few years, often tied in with broader affordability concerns in the face of rising inflation and stagnant wage growth. The crisis of living space and cost is why 3D printed houses were initially thought to be a bit of a game changer. With development times for traditional housing ever expanding and the costs of doing business increasing, the ability to quickly and cheaply 3D print housing structures held the potential to completely upend the housing market. That could have led to a huge production boom and made prices more affordable for everyone, regardless of whether the house had been traditionally built or 3D printed. That's not, however, how things have worked out in practice. Despite the promise of the technology, there has not been a 3D printed housing boom. You'd have probably noticed that on Zillow. In 2023, there were at best a few dozen 3D printed homes, once you exclude the ones built for show purposes. And although there is no global body keeping track of the exact number of 3D printed homes worldwide, the best estimates we have still peg that number somewhere in the low to mid hundreds. That would barely make a dent in a mid-sized city's housing market, let alone an entire country's. But if building houses using 3D printing technology is faster and cheaper than building them the traditional way, and yeah, it probably is, then why is the technology as a whole failing to meet expectations? Well, to understand that, we first had to understand the process of 3D printing. I'm 3D printing something right now on a little Prusa 3D printer. How does 3D printing work? 3D printing is the process of constructing a three-dimensional object using a blueprint in the form of a CAD, computer-assisted design model, or a digital 3D model. The materials, which can include plastics, liquids, and powder grains, are fused together under computer control, usually one layer at a time. This process can take anywhere from several hours to a few days, depending on the object being created and the type of printer being used. The advantages of 3D printing over making something by hand or through a traditional production method are vast. One of the more important is the ability to create objects with complex geometries that would otherwise just be difficult to produce at scale through other means. The technology is also very precise when it comes to material use. For example, imagine you need a star shape for an art project. Your first idea might be to cut out a piece of corkboard or whatever material you're working with and make it into a star shape. Obviously. But what happens to the excess material, the stuff left over after you cut out the star? Well, yeah, most of the time you just throw it in the trash, don't you? Well, when it comes to 3D printing, the printer can simply make a star shape with little to no excess material loss. As the technology advances, it may help cut down on labor, maintenance, and material costs, even outside of generally reducing waste. All of this would be huge for any industry, but especially housing construction, which is a labor-intensive, high-waste business. If 3D printed housing construction were to take off, it could not only theoretically address the supply issue, but also lower the cost of building a house in general, essentially addressing the price issue at both ends of the equation. Beyond the basics we already discussed, however, 3D printed construction projects face some additional challenges. When using 3D printers for construction, the materials are typically concrete, cement, wax, foam, and polymers, which can be produced both off-site and on, depending on the company and the printers involved in the project. Still, that is just for the bare structure of the house. It does not include things like wiring up electricity or any other finishing touches necessary. A basement or foundation structure will also usually have to still be assembled, at least in part, on site. Still, the printing process itself can be quick. Chinese company Winsun claimed to be able to print 10 houses in 24 hours, with each costing around $5,000 each before windows, doors, and other important features have been installed. Now, this claim was later disputed, but other companies have also claimed to be able to print the base structure for a house in roughly a day, though depending on the material, it may require more time to dry. Clay-printed houses, for example, may take weeks to fully dry out. Put this all together, and the overall picture is that while 3D printed housing is faster and cheaper than traditional methods, it's not yet as fast and as cheap as you might expect. And all of this excludes the initial startup costs of buying a printer capable of pumping out housing components in the first place. There are also still some tricky technical issues. Solid concrete, the primary material used in 3D printed housing construction, is a terrible insulator with basically zero resistance to heat flow. Worse still, concrete acts as a heat bridge, bleeding out heat during harsh winters and even drawing in more solar energy during the height of summer. The technical details are a little bit complicated, but there's essentially no way for concrete alone to reach the levels of heat insulation needed to satisfy modern building codes. There are solutions. For example, you can print a hollow shell of concrete as the strong, sturdy part of the wall and then fill it with insulation to make sure you reach the heat flow resistance necessary to meet codes. Other methods, like printing the insulation concurrently with the concrete, are still in their infancy and are not yet fully developed. So this is another bit of extra time and expense necessary to facilitate the construction of 3D printed houses. There are also concerns about environmental impacts, and standard concrete has a high carbon footprint, and cement production already accounts for about 8% of all global CO2 emissions. With environmental regulations in place to slow down or mitigate climate change, and a large block of people deeply concerned about the environment, a high CO2 material used in a developing technology that has yet to mature is just a target for regulation. While some printer methods claim to be lower in carbon than others, there isn't much independent verification of these claims as of yet. Still, if these were the only problems facing the industry, we would probably already be seeing entire 3D printer communities popping up all over the world, hailed as the magic bullet capable of solving the housing crisis. But there are two things worse than delays and higher than expected costs keeping the industry from rapid expansion: cracks and bureaucracy. So in November of 2024, the town of Muscatine in Iowa decided to tear down a 3D printed home. Why? Well, it had failed to meet structural benchmarks, which is a fancy way of saying that the concrete used in the home's construction was cracking. Rob Monahan, Housing Initiative Manager of the Community Foundation of Greater Muscatine, which is overseeing the project, spoke to Forbes saying, quote, "We had vertical cracking and some horizontal cracking, which was less of a concern, and we knew we had issues," end quote, referring to the strength of the concrete. Construction began in May, and even just a few months later, the problems were already becoming apparent. The material wasn't hitting their benchmarks for structural soundness, and they had failed to even identify the reason for the cracks, quoting, "We're still trying to sort out whether it was because of climate." End quote. Which is a reasonable guess, given that the heat index had reached 120 degrees over the summer and been coupled with high humidity. Zachary Mannheimer, founder of the subcontractor on the project, quoting him, "Frustration is probably not the word I would use. We learned so much from the process itself." According to Mannheimer, the walls were structurally sound, but the cracks were concerning enough to merit a teardown. Alquist, the company behind it, has since developed a new material that's stronger, less expensive, and carbon neutral, though that's little comfort to the town of Muscatine. The problem is that 3D printing is still a finicky process, especially at the housing scale. Small differences in heat or humidity can have drastic consequences for a structure as it's being printed or as it dries. So can small differences in the composition of the material being printed. At one early 3D printing project in Saudi Arabia, they kept the printing materials in air-conditioned containers to prevent any heat-related chemical reactions. Any changes to these variables could lead to cracks down the road, and it would be hard to tell which one was the cause. Now, of course, this means that without advancements in the composition of the material and its resistance to heat, humidity, and minor variations in makeup, the most reliable way to construct 3D printed houses will be in off-site facilities. This will naturally mean that building parts have to be transported to the construction site, which means, once again, the cost difference between 3D printing and traditional construction will narrow. And for Muscatine, a small town in Iowa, it means they'll be left behind, a casualty of an industry still finding its footing. Alquist relocated to Colorado under the guidance of its new CEO, Patrick Callahan. Of the project in Iowa, industry consultant Stephen Mansour said, quote, "I was hoping they would destroy it, the home, because in traditional construction, that's what you do. For the industry, it's not a black eye. The black eye would be if somebody lived in it." End quote. While the cracks would be bad enough on their own, they are a technical issue that is solvable. After all, there are examples of 3D printed homes having been fully constructed without suffering these issues. Once we get enough experience with the technology and understand what causes the cracks, we'll be able to develop new systems or materials in order to prevent them. So, a hit to productivity in the short term and a major struggle for individual companies, but it's not a death blow to the field itself. Instead, it's regulatory hurdles that may be the true barrier to widespread adoption. Construction is understandably one of the most regulated industries in the world, and while 3D printed housing shows promise, it is at the end of the day a basically unproven method for housing development. Theoretically, houses made from cement should last for a century or more and be resistant to weather damage, insects like termites, fires, and other common household hazards than traditional homes, but we just don't know if the theory will stand the test of time. Unlike with traditional housing, where we can simply point to a 150-year-old house and say, look, it's 150 years old. We obviously can't do that for 3D printed structures yet. We didn't have those in the 19th century. Less well-made 3D printed homes may show cracks within months, but it may also be the case that even the better-made ones will show signs of deterioration in 20 years, in 5 years, maybe just 1 year. We just don't really know yet. And that has made regulators wary of approving 3D printed housing projects and has made the projects themselves vulnerable to regulatory changes from everything from safety advocates to environmentalists. And of course, a huge reason houses aren't getting built the traditional way in the first place, despite massive persistent demand, is a regulatory and local zoning framework that discourages housing projects in general. Having a new, cheap way to build houses doesn't actually offer a benefit if your local zoning board is rejecting all development plans regardless, but I mean, that's a whole other issue. Still, despite the challenges, some intrepid companies are trying to make the technology work, gambling that the technical hurdles to the printing process can be solved, while the cost-efficiency proposition of 3D printed houses will win hearts and minds of both regulatory and zoning boards. There's only one problem, though. The projects keep failing. Cairo is a small town in It's not in Illinois, it's not in Egypt. In Egypt, it's a massive Gulf city. It's one of the furthest south in the entire state, sitting closer to Kentucky and Missouri than to Chicago. With a population of less than 2,000 and one that has been declining in recent decades, Cairo seemed like exactly the kind of place where a 3D printing housing venture could thrive. While cities are also in dire need of housing, the problem there is more one of space and regulatory hurdles, not the availability of resources necessary to build in the first place. Cairo is the opposite. Lacking the resources for a thorough housing push and not particularly desirable as a place to move, building a neighborhood of 3D houses could make construction projects economically feasible, improve the lives of residents, and even attract new people to the shrinking town. Enter Prestige Project Management, which in late summer 2024 had finalized a deal with Cairo to build 30 duplexes. Only days later, crews had arrived and were ready to conduct the groundbreaking. The first duplex constructed was hailed as the first new house built in a small city in nearly 3 decades. Over 100 people had shown up for the groundbreaking ceremony. People cheered. Hope was in the air. This project was just the beginning, according to Mayor Thomas Stimson. State Senator Dale Fowler, whose district covered some of the most impoverished residents in all of Illinois, also hailed the beginning of the project as a step toward greater prosperity for residents. Fowler, in particular, put his money where his mouth was, quite literally. His nonprofit had secured a $40,000 donation to pay for the groundbreaking event. Construction, or should we say printing, began in earnest, and within a month, the walls of the first duplex had gone up and interior work had begun. And then, the project suddenly stalled. The owners would later blame our old friend, cracks in the structure, for the delay, saying that they needed to verify the structural integrity of the unit. Prestige waited for over a year to be presented with a plan to deal with the cracks from the printer supplier, but none ever came. Time continued to pass, no one moved into the duplex, and the on-site printer was quietly moved elsewhere. That's around when reporters started asking questions. It was uncovered that Prestige, the company contracted to build the houses, had bizarrely forfeited a $590,000 deposit on a different printer when they suddenly cancelled their order. Perhaps even more ominously, several employees had quit Prestige right around the time of the groundbreaking. The exodus of workers happened to coincide with an anonymous email making the rounds that claimed Prestige's foray into 3D printing was little more than a publicity stunt and that the company had allegedly engaged in fraud during its other construction projects. It wasn't just reporters asking questions either. The FBI had gotten curious about Prestige's activities as well, launching an investigation into the company. To date, there haven't been any arrests, but it certainly isn't a good look for the company or its owners. Jamie Hayes and Eric Burtis founded Prestige in 2021. The offices were located in Harrisburg, another small town in Illinois, less than 100 miles away from Cairo, though with a population of 8,000, it was significantly larger. It was one of 7 companies that Hayes had started since 2020, 3 of which were co-founded with Burtis. With Hayes as the money man and Burtis in charge of day-to-day operations, the pair built up a varied set of businesses, going into school construction management, solar farm fencing, and of course, 3D printing duplexes for the small town of Cairo. After getting advice from his son Josh about what was hot in construction, Burtis decided to go into 3D printing in 2023. Once Burtis had zeroed in on Cairo, an area in desperate need of development, as the starting point for the new printing venture, he said that God had encouraged him to donate the first home as a show of goodwill. Still, residents had been burned before by big promises and high hopes, only for it all to come crashing down. So, let's just say there were some skeptics. Connie Williams, a city council member, said, quote, "We kept saying to them, look, we've had enough people come through Cairo talking all this crazy stuff and then back out. And they were just like, no, that's not us, we're here. God sent us." End quote. Despite the trail of broken promises scattered around Cairo, the project appeared credible enough to elite policymakers in Illinois. Governor J.B. Pritzker met with both Burtis and Dale Fowler, while staff of United States Senator Tammy Duckworth were invited to learn more about the project. Prestige's first printed home got a boost on social media when Susan Mendoza, the Illinois comptroller, praised the project in a post. But political support, or at least engagement, and a glitzy groundbreaking ceremony were distracting from deep problems within Prestige, which suggested that Cairo's latest attempt at revitalization was on shaky ground even before construction crews began building the very first duplex. To begin with, Prestige had secured a $1.1 million loan in order to purchase a printer in the first place, a loan so large that it required a rural lender in Karnak, Illinois, to partner with another bank to get around its single customer lending limit. Once the loan was approved, Prestige put down a $590,000 payment on a printer, which would be built by Perry 3D Construction in Texas. Their contract stated that the printer would be delivered in 6 months at the earliest. Despite being aware of the uncertainty around the delivery of the printer, Hayes and Burtis began to grow impatient. They had given Cairo their word that they would begin construction in the spring, and the delivery schedule threatened that promise. While at a concrete industry expo, Burtis met a team from a New Jersey-based 3D printer production company who said they had printers available for immediate delivery. Burtis and Hayes quickly pivoted to the new company, informing Perry 3D that they would no longer need their services and suggesting they keep $60,000 of the original payment. Perry, of course, did no such thing and kept the entire deposit, exactly like any company would in that situation. It is a deposit, after all. This was in April, right before their printer would have been due. Prestige had essentially lit more than $500,000 on fire. Fortunately, the New Jersey company was willing to sell them a printer for the $500,000 that they had left. Speaking about the debacle, Hayes had this to say: "If I get 10 grand for a car, say I pay 5 grand for a car and I don't get my money back, but I can buy another car that does the exact same thing and I only pay another 5,000, what do I give it if I can get back and forth to work?" Now, of course, this meant that their promise to start construction in the spring went from iffy to impossible, since even this new company wouldn't be able to deliver the printer until August. Keep in mind that all of this, the loan, the multiple printers, the delays, it was all to build just a single duplex. Theoretically, once the upfront costs of buying and delivering a printer were taken care of, the advantages of faster construction time and cheaper materials would begin to pay dividends. But this initial stage was essentially a proof of concept as opposed to a magical solution to Cairo's housing issues, and they were struggling even with that. This didn't go unnoticed by town leaders. When asked where the company would be getting the funding to build the remaining 30 or so homes that had been agreed upon, Prestige was evasive, not giving a straight answer. For a project like this, one possible solution would have to be to apply for housing tax credits. These applications can take years to wind their way through the system, and would have been challenging for Prestige to get approval for, given that they were essentially trialing a new technology in a rural community. I'm looking at putting solar panels on the roof of a building, and believe me, the process, even for that, is crazy. But it's notable that they didn't even seem to try. There's no record of Prestige ever having applied for one of these programs. Eventually, Burtis told Cairo officials that they themselves would need to come up with the funds for future construction. But of course, if Cairo had that kind of money in the first place, they would have already built the housing they needed. The town and Prestige were able to reach an agreement where Cairo would sell the printing company a vacant lot for $1. Prestige would build a duplex and manage it for 18 months, then transfer ownership back to the city. The contract called for an additional 29 duplexes to be built, but did not detail how they would be financed. In 2025, a reporter began to pick up the thread of the Cairo 3D printed housing project story and sought to get in contact with Hayes, the money man behind Prestige. One of the first things she asked for was to see the printer itself, which Hayes agreed to, casually revealing that the printer, which would be the size of a small garage if fully assembled, was stored on Hayes' personal backlot. But as they toured the lot, passing rows of cars, it became clear that the printer was nowhere to be found, though Hayes didn't seem particularly upset about that fact. "I don't see it. Do you?" he said with a shrug. It had apparently been there at one point, but had since been moved to places unknown. That bizarre moment would begin to paint the picture of Hayes and Prestige, which he revealed had been named after the do-nothing company from the comedy movie Step Brothers. Hayes claimed to have sued Perry 3D to recover that nearly $600,000 deposit that they'd lost, but couldn't provide any details. He could not even say where the supposed lawsuit had been filed. But it turned out that it had indeed been filed. Prestige alleged in their lawsuit that Perry 3D had had Prestige sign a mock document, not a real contract, and that the document they'd signed did not contain the language that forfeited the deposit. The lawsuit reached a conclusion right around the time Perry 3D was laying off its US-based staff. A judge did eventually rule in Prestige's favor because Perry chose not to respond to the suit, but instead had this to say: "I guess good luck trying to collect it." Hayes knew they were never going to collect their deposit back, but still seemed chipper at the result, saying in text, "Looks like we did sue, and won." Getting the money would have been quite helpful for Prestige because under their lending agreement, the company owes the bank around $13,000 a month, every month, for 10 years, which essentially works out to $400,000 worth of interest on the $1.1 million loan. Of course, since Prestige hadn't made any money from the Cairo project, it couldn't make those payments itself. Instead, Hayes was covering them from one of his other business accounts. But none of that was Hayes' fault, at least according to him. Perry 3D's tricky contract and his hands-off approach had burned him, but he still had every intention of fulfilling his obligation to Cairo. Don't believe him? Well, just ask State Senator Dale Fowler. He'd back them up. Quote, "Ask Dale Fowler if there's anything going wrong," Hayes said. Being pointed to as the political force behind Prestige was news to Dale Fowler, who downplayed his role in the project, casting himself as more of a fan on the sideline cheering on. His description of his relationship with Hayes and Burtis painted a picture of cordiality, but not true friendship. That's an interesting characterization because Dale Fowler had actually done quite a lot to move the 3D printing project forward. For example, Fowler's office had emailed Prestige promotional materials to the Illinois Housing Development Agency and had also brought up the project to the State Poverty Commission not long after the loan for the printer had been secured. It was Fowler himself who had led State Comptroller Mendoza on a tour that included Burtis and his son. And it was Fowler who had facilitated a meeting between Senator Duckworth's office and the management team of Prestige. Cairo residents themselves certainly associated the state senator with the project. As the work began to hit snags and problems began to pile up, local leaders were reaching out to Fowler with questions. Quoting, "When it fell through, we were all calling Senator Fowler personally because he brought them here." That quote was from Williams, a council member. Altogether, this felt like quite a bit more than cheerleading from the sidelines, especially once you factor in that Prestige had essentially been Fowler's largest source of campaign contributions, excluding money coming in from political action committees. In total, Prestige donated around $22,000 to Dale Fowler from May of 2022 to August of 2024. The final $6,500 donation came less than a week before the groundbreaking ceremony for that first duplex. Despite claiming that the pair were merely his acquaintances, Fowler had apparently known Hayes and Burtis for decades. When pressed about the FBI investigation, he said he expected that they had done nothing wrong and that he'd taken unfair heat for his association with them. He compared himself to Daniel, the Old Testament hero, who was about to be torn to shreds by lions after being thrown into their den, but instead angels came down and closed their mouths, causing his enemies to be killed instead. Fowler's term expires in January, and he has declined to seek re-election. Maybe a smart move, allegedly. And now let's talk about that FBI investigation that we just casually dropped in there. As I've already mentioned, it wasn't just reporters who were investigating Prestige, the FBI were as well. Just a few weeks after the groundbreaking party, Prestige received a federal grand jury subpoena for its financial records, and the subpoenas kept on rolling from there. The FBI also obtained the work contracts and payment records sent to Prestige from 2 school districts in the city of Harrisburg, though this was for work unrelated to the 3D printed duplex project. John Peake, the mayor of Harrisburg, stated that the city had done 2 projects with Prestige and that Dale Fowler had encouraged them to do more. Meanwhile, one of the school districts that had been subpoenaed fired its superintendent as he had not gone through the proper channels to get approval for the $2 million spent on projects through Prestige and other companies. And remember how a number of Prestige employees had quit right around the time of the groundbreaking? Well, it turns out that at least one of them had turned informant. Bucky Miller, who had been hired in part to sell the development plan to Cairo officials, had become a whistleblower to the FBI. To hear Miller tell it, he had been taken advantage of, sold the dream of bringing fast, cheap, 3D printed houses to an impoverished area, only to have that dream shattered at every opportunity. Prestige never had any intention of completing the project, he claimed. A little while after the groundbreaking, there had been a flurry of emails from an anonymous account that went out to businesses and government entities that had contracted with Prestige, alleging that the company had committed fraud. At one point, Miller took credit for these anonymous emails, before later recanting and saying he hadn't sent them at all. Unsurprisingly, this turned into a he-said situation, with Hayes and Burtis blaming Miller and Miller throwing it right back at them. In terms of the investigation, Burtis claimed to have been fully cooperative with the FBI, saying the company had turned over all records that had been requested. He also mentions that he had never been interviewed by investigators. Quoting, "If I was really in trouble, don't you think I'd have been handed an indictment by now?" So, what happened to the duplex? Well, it's sitting abandoned. The printer has been idle for who knows how long, scattered in pieces throughout various properties owned by Hayes. The reason for this, Hayes claims, is that the concrete ink used in the printer is faulty and they're waiting on a replacement from Black Buffalo 3D, the New Jersey-based company that Hayes and Burtis had purchased their printer from after their initial attempt fell through. Black Buffalo has promised to replace the supposedly faulty concrete and even offered to find another buyer for the printer if Prestige no longer wanted it. The 2 companies also claimed they would work together to fix the cracks in the duplex, although they took care to insist that those cracks were largely cosmetic and not structural. They even sent a joint email claiming that they would soon return to Cairo to fix the cracks. But of course, this didn't happen. Black Buffalo said they couldn't sign off on work because they needed a permit from the city. This was essentially a nonsense excuse because permits are not required for the work being done. Black Buffalo has only sold 2 printers in the US since being founded in late 2020, and it has filed for bankruptcy. While crews were recently seen conducting work on the single duplex that had been sort of constructed, many people in Cairo felt left behind and forgotten. That's not new to them. Many development initiatives have come and gone without fulfilling their promises. But something was different this time. Cairo city attorney said, quoting, "I've seen a lot of deals fall through, but we always knew why. Here, we got nothing. Even today, I probably have a lot more questions than I've got answers." End quote. After years of attempting to reverse population decline and address a housing crisis, all Cairo has to show for it is a single duplex sitting empty. Kanisha Mallory, who had hoped to move into either that duplex or one of the others that was supposed to be built, was left waiting for a home that would simply never come. So, real talk. Are Jamie Hayes and Eric Burtis a pair of remorseless scammers who took advantage of a town in desperate need to conduct some sort of fraud scheme? Well, no, probably not. While there are questions about their business practices, there have been no criminal indictments by the FBI, and reporters haven't uncovered a smoking gun of illegal activity. That's not to say that Prestige hasn't broken the law or won't be indicted, but I attribute the situation more to ineptitude than criminal malice, at least with the information we have right now. But it's clear that the pair didn't fully think through the logistics of launching a 3D printing construction business and proceeded to make that Cairo's problem. The technology is new and exciting and developing quickly. That can be attractive to entrepreneurs who think that if they can get in before 3D printing has quite gone mainstream, they can make a huge profit once the industry explodes in popularity. That leads to cases like Cairo and Muscatine in Iowa. These are towns that really could benefit from cheaply produced housing. The upsides are there, but because the companies involved either didn't think through or weren't aware of the challenges of 3D printing, these towns have been left out to dry. And that's a shame, because there have been success stories. A 2-story 3D printed home was completed in Japan earlier last year. Japan, known for its frequent and powerful earthquakes, has strict safety standards when it comes to residences. All homes, and all buildings in general, must be made sufficiently earthquake resistant to be used. The house, which apparently borrowed design principles from naturally occurring caves, managed to get approval from Japan's regulators, which are some of the strictest in the world, although I'm not sure I fancy living in a cave. Quoting, Japan has some of the most demanding seismic requirements in the world. Seeing a government-approved 2-story 3D printed reinforced concrete house completed here confirms that 3D construction printing is ready for projects that rely on structural precision and consistent quality, also in seismic areas. That quote's from Henrik Lund Nielsen, the founder and general manager of Cobot International, a leading 3D printer production company. The fact that the house has 2 stories was also a huge leap forward in the technology, since previous homes had traditionally been restricted to a single story like the duplex in Cairo. The ability to build homes of 2 or possibly even more stories really opens up the potential of the technology, making it possible to fit more people within a single building, or even just making the houses more appealing to families looking for a new home. While high-profile failures like the Cairo project have soured people's tastes towards 3D printed ventures, the technology still does hold a lot of promise. It could address our housing supply crisis. It has the potential to lower CO2 emissions if deployed thoughtfully. It could also lead to a boom in construction, not just of houses, but of any type of structure. Houses built this way will likely last for 100 years and be far more durable, mold-resistant and insect-resistant than traditional wooden housing. The technology's here, the demand is here. We just have to decide we want to build it and properly think through the logistics of doing so. Thank you for watching.
Before we start, I want to prompt the audience. What's your favorite Volition game? Personally, Saints Row 2 will never be beat. Also, if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. Volition, a great developer with a vast pedigree and a 30-plus year history. One day they were creating some of the greatest games of their generation. The next they they were gone in almost the blink of an eye. So what happened? How did Volition go from one of the best to non-existence in such a short span of time?
It is taking shape. The hour is nigh.
Now, some of you may be confused here on account of the fact that I already did a retrospective on Volition several years back, but if I'm being honest, I didn't do a very good job with it. It wasn't a particularly well-researched video, and the overall point of why the company was closed down was actually missed. So now that I'm older, a bit more experienced in this realm, and more keen to deep dive, I wanted to give it another shot. So let's start all the way back in the beginning. In the history of Volition, the company went under a few names, but when they first started, they were known as Parallax Software. Well, that's not the entirety of the full story, but we'll get to that. The studio was founded in Champaign, Illinois by the partnership of Mike Koulos and Matt Toshlog in 1993. They met while working at a company called Sublogic, a company founded in 1977 that ran all the way until 1996, which specialized in flight simulators. Now, what does a flight simulator that came out in the late 70s look like? Well, it looks like this. Fiddle-dee-dee. Check that 2 seconds per frame gameplay. Mike Koulos apparently joined Sublogic all the way back in 1981 and stayed until 1990, while Matt Toshlog joined the company in 1986 and left by 1988. In spite of their ships only passing for 2 years, they apparently struck up a good enough friendship that they had the idea of going independent. Matt Toshlog was the first to leave, going on to work as a freelance developer for a company called Loner Research, and in particular for a game called Car and Driver. It was a simpler time. Eventually, Mike also joined him in his endeavors, and after Car and Driver came out in 1992, they started to really consider the idea of their next game. Obviously, since their experience was largely to do with flight simulators at this point, that was what they were sticking with, and they came up with the idea of a free-form flight simulator with combat elements. They attempted to pitch the idea to Looking Glass, but they were dissatisfied with the response they got from Looking Glass, largely because the two men wanted to keep their intellectual property, though Matt would actually go on to work for Looking Glass, and in particular on their 1994 hit System Shock. But with that said, the two of them decided they had enough experience that they could theoretically start their own company to make this grand vision while still maintaining the intellectual property rights and creative control. They also had long since grown tired of the incompetent management that they had been dealing with. It's even said they thought that running a company wasn't going to be that difficult. On his personal website, Mike had this to say: "Matt and I decided we could do a better job than management had done and formed Parallax Software," which shows a beautifully casual attitude towards something so potentially big. It's also said they thought their idea was too good to let anybody else get their grubby hands on it, not in those words obviously. Following this, they got to work on their grand vision, an indoor combat flight simulator. Technology was quickly improving, and their vision became more and more ambitious as time went on. Granted, for this time, ambitious meant having textured polygons, but despite their ambition, the overall mission statement was relatively simple. In an interview with Wired.com, Mike Koulos laid out the design philosophy behind the game. "Our aim was to create an 80s-style arcade game with 90s technology. We wanted a full 3D environment in which the player was surrounded by interesting structures and threats in all dimensions. However, with ambition came scope creep, which meant more employees, which meant more money. Originally, the game was going to be published by Apogee Software, but the game's cost started to become too much for them to justify, which left development in limbo for a while until after sending the pitch to over 50 different companies, it was Interplay who wrote back and immediately agreed to publish the game. After hiring on some more people, the game that was initially called Miner, then became Inferno, and finally settled on the name Descent went into full-scale development. After 21 months in development, the game was released on home computers in March of 1995 and ported to PlayStation a year later. The game was groundbreaking, releasing to universal acclaim. While the game's impact would fade over time, contemporary reviews thought it groundbreaking on the level of the original Doom, which is about as high praise as you could possibly get in PC gaming circles. And I know some fans might take exception to the idea of saying its influence has faded over time, but I can say with certainty that 95% of the game-playing public knows what Doom is, but even among my friends and fellow content creators, I would say half, maybe less, would know what Descent is. even if it does somewhat deserve that level of iconography. Sales-wise, it's hard to know exactly how many copies it sold because contemporaneously, Interplay had said that Descent 1 and 2 combined to a total of 1.1 million sales after release, and yet according to a report by a company called VentureBeat, the sales numbers for the first game alone could have been as high as 25 million, which is quite the spread. Either way, it was an instant hit and an instant classic, and a sequel would follow very quickly, though not quite as quickly as intended. Because the game that became Descent 2 was originally intended as an expansion pack to the first game that eventually expanded scope enough to justify a solo release. Still, the game came out roughly 1 year later, right around the time the first game was coming out for PlayStation, and was considered a pretty much functionally identical game to the first with some notable additions such as improved AI. Not that it was a bad thing, it still reviewed very well, it just didn't have the same universal acclaim the first game had. Now there was another Descent game, but it wasn't actually developed by Parallax Software. This is where things get weird, because my assumption at first was that Parallax made Descent 3, and so I found myself questioning why it didn't. And when researching the company, I was also wondering when Parallax became Volition. But this next part of the story answers both those questions. Technically, Volition and Parallax aren't actually the same thing under different names. Parallax Software was actually sort of the parent company of Volition, and I don't mean parent company as in a company that owns another company, I mean a literal parent company as in the studio gave birth to the other studio. Let me explain. Around this time, the founders of the studio, Mike and Matt, were having a disagreement in staying in Champaign, Illinois. So Matt opted to take a few employees and relocate to an office space in Ann Arbor, Michigan in an amicable compromise. This split would officially happen about 8 months after the release of Descent 2, which would be in and around November of 1996. At which point, the Ann Arbor studio would rename itself to Outrage Entertainment. The two studios would still largely be collaborative, but would gradually become their own things over time. Outrage would go on to make Descent 3, make 2 versions of Red Faction 2, and would make an original game called Alter Echo, a game which apparently was such a massive financial flop that it caused the studio to be shut down by THQ in only 2004, 2 years after being purchased by them. Some studio members would then migrate back to the original studio. But of course, the original Parallax office still remained, and since their second office was officially going to spin off and become a different studio, now was the right time for the other half of the mitosis to rename itself, with Parallax having officially broken into 2. And apparently Mike Koulos did not know what to name the studio. He apparently received over 50 suggestions and hated every single one of them. This is until he stumbled across the word Volition while looking through the books in his living room and felt that the word Volition was not only a catchy name, but also matched the energy of what a game development studio is. And from there, they were off to the races. While Outrage worked on the third Descent game, Volition got to work on their next game, titled Descent Free Space. Although the full title is Descent Free Space: The Great War. And Knuckles, featuring Dante from Devil May Cry. I made that last part up. It's funny that this game retains the Descent title in spite of the fact that it's famously not connected to that series in any way, though it's not as cynical as you may think. The reason why they put the prefix of Descent is because FreeSpace was an existing company and they didn't want to infringe on any intellectual property. FreeSpace was yet another flight sim to add to the ever-growing list that the founding members of Parallax/Volition were responsible for, but this one would be quite different, as they stepped away from the illegitimate flight sims or the indoor combat flight sims they were known for and were now stepping into the realms of a more open space combat flight sim inspired by the likes of Wing Commander, including the implementation of an in-depth story more robust than their previous games. And the original conceptualization was by a somewhat newer member of the studio named Adam Pletcher, though I can't find any specific interviews from him detailing anything about the game. In fact, information is surprisingly hard to come by about this game, because many of the archived interviews upon release have been lost. I mean, one of the sites that got cited as having the interviews on them just hyperlinks to a bunch of porn sites now. So I wish I could give you more info on the game, but there were still some things to note about this game, such as how it was pretty much built from scratch. The physics were very impressive for the time, and the AI was specifically programmed to be different depending on difficulty. Lots of fun stuff. But when the game came out, it didn't perform to the same level as either of the Descent games, but reviewed well and sold perfectly adequately. Meanwhile, Free Space 2 would be their next project they would work on. It was considered an extremely rushed project off the back of the publisher Interplay wanting to boost their stock price with big releases, as they had gone public shortly before this. Despite that, the game actually finished ahead of the rushed schedule. Either way, Free Space 2 came out about a year later. It was made pretty much to be more or less a refinement of the first. And it was just that, considered an improvement in pretty much every way, leading to universal acclaim. But it ended up being a significant commercial failure to the point it was considered one of the most criminally overlooked games of its era, and to this day has a very passionate niche fan base. Not to be discouraged, they wanted to make a bunch of extra content for it, but the publisher Interplay stepped in and put the kibosh on that. Despite being their publisher since the very first Descent, the friction of the rushed schedule combined with Interplay's financial troubles would lead this to being the last time that Volition would work with Interplay. Following this, they would work on one of their least known titles, Summoner, an RPG title which was a day one launch title for the PlayStation 2. It was considered a moderate success for the company, but it still paled in comparison to the heights of what the company experienced at its best with Descent. The most noteworthy thing about the game is that it was the first time that Volition worked with THQ, and as a matter of fact, while THQ agreed to publish the game in 1999, about 2 months before the game came out, on August 31st, 2000, THQ officially acquired Volition. So they clearly had faith in this proven but currently fledgling studio, just in time for their next title, which would arguably be the thing that officially brought Volition back to their peak, which fittingly began as a Descent game. Initially they were making Descent 4, but that was cancelled, and some of the technology was repurposed into what would become the original Red Faction. This game featured an innovative technology called Geomod, which was a groundbreaking bit of tech that allowed you to alter the environment around you in real time. According to an interview with IGN, Philip Holt laid out the intention behind the game, and the fact the developers wanted to implement environmental destruction pretty much from the word go. I can't recall who first came up with the idea, but from the start of the project, it was one of the main design goals. Everyone had played games where you fire a rocket at a wall and nothing happens, and we wanted to be the first game that allowed you to really blast apart the environment. It turned out that just blowing the crap out of the world around you is fundamentally fun, and that was the system that the game was built around, to the point where it kind of overshadows the rest of the game, but it was still an ambitious thing considering that very few developers even to this day have ever tried something similar, giving you the ability to properly destroy the world around you. And even if it was considered maybe a one-note gimmick, it worked, considering the game reviewed well and sold well over 1 million copies. From there, they went on to make a second Summoner game and a second Red Faction game, both of which reviewed well and sold perfectly well. Though I have heard anecdotally that Red Faction fans tend to look back on the second game very poorly, and after this they went on to make the Punisher game, one of my personal favorite PS2 games. Apparently they had a game they were working on called Underground, which was cancelled in 2002. But around this time THQ got the license for the Punisher and decided to get Volition to take the unfinished Underground game and rework it into a Punisher game, much like how the Geomod technology sort of overshadowed Red Faction. Something else overshadowed the Punisher game, despite its very fun gameplay and its involvement from a couple of veterans of the comic industry, Garth Ennis and Jimmy Palmiotti, as co-writers of the game, making for one of the most authentic feeling superhero games of its day, which directly ties into the thing that overshadows the game, the brutality, because before release, Volition was in a back and forth battle with the ESRB to get the game to a saleable rating, as the initial version of the game was given the dreaded adult-only rating, particularly because of all the ridiculous executions you could perform on enemies. The controversy and censorship didn't harm the game any, as it managed to be successful on a similar level to the first Red Faction, but despite a booming beginning and a few decent hits after, Volition had yet to reach its public apex. This apex would begin the next year. Originally conceptualized as a game called Bling Bling in 2003, Volition wanted to create their own version of a Grand Theft Auto style open world, and in fact, they were very open about the comparisons to Grand Theft Auto at the time. Around the time of the game's release, executive producer Dan Cermak was quoted in several cases as saying, "We're not ashamed to be compared to Grand Theft Auto." And in other instances, it said they were also open about much of the design being inspired, if not outright copied, from GTA 3, though I can't find any direct quotes on that. Still, the game in question is none other than the original Saints Row, released on August 26, 2006 as an Xbox 360 exclusive, and was one of the earliest success stories of that console. Despite the earliness in which it was released and the fact that it was exclusive, it still sold well over 2 million copies. This was easily their biggest success since the first Descent game, and was proof of the idea having staying power through its unique combination of a quirky yet grounded world, its unique setup that made every aspect of the game matter, and a very shocking ending. It was quite the launching pad for the franchise. I suppose they felt the same way, because instead of focusing on other franchises, they decided to keep up the momentum and immediately work on a sequel. By this point, it was clear that the comparisons to GTA were not lost on them, and as a matter of fact, these comparisons were partially what drove them to succeed and make something that stood out on its own. Lead designer James Sile laid it all out when he was quoted as saying, "Reading through some of the early gaming blogs and previews, you can find commentary that was pretty nasty, with some people openly rooting for SR2 to fail. For us, that really brought into focus the risks of going up against such a respected and a long-standing franchise with a lot of loyal fans. There's a fine line between daring and foolishness, and sometimes you just have to stop worrying about which side of that line you're on." But he also specified that the team understood the comparisons and expected them, with such sentiments to that effect as, "You don't jump into the pool if you're not ready to get wet." With that said, there was always a stated intention of further trying to differentiate themselves from GTA. Game producer Greg Donovan laid this out in a 2009 interview with GameSetWatch.com. From the start, the team's fundamental goal was to create an original open-world gameplay experience that would further distinguish Saints Row from other non-linear games and carve out a distinct identity in the genre. We aimed to achieve this by iterating gameplay that worked in Saints Row and cutting those mechanics and features that did not work. 3 years of analysis, collaboration, discussion, and hard work followed and concluded with a game that we feel was ultimately able to accomplish these goals. The game found itself coming out on October 14, 2008, releasing to critical acclaim and selling well over 3 million units. Though the critical acclaim that it received didn't quite do the game justice in my opinion, God's honest truth, I believe that Saints Row 2 and GTA 4 deserve to have their Metacritic scores swapped, because 83 I would say is appropriate for GTA 4, whereas the almost perfect 98 out of 100 to me is more fitting for Saints Row 2, because Saints Row 2 is legitimately one of my favorite games of all time. It is absolutely sublime front to back. Credit to GTA 4, nothing had ever felt so blisteringly real, but to me, Saints Row 2 is simply unparalleled fun. It's equal parts zany and heartfelt, there's so much variety to gameplay and customization, it more or less forces you to engage with the side content, and this game has some of the most fun, action-packed side content I've ever seen, and still manages to contextualize all of it. It is in very rarefied air as being part of my personal S tier of games, as in for me, it is the top 1% of the top 1%. The only thing I don't like about it, and this is actually a pretty big issue, the PC port is abysmal, and even with things like the Gentleman of the Row mod, it still crashed to desktop like 20 times the last time I played it. But in fairness, the PC port wasn't made by Volition. The game was a hit, and it was absolutely fantastic, and to make it better, they followed it up with another game I would consider to be in my personal S tier. That would be the return of Red Faction with 2009's Red Faction Guerrilla, a game that had apparently been conceptualized all the way back in 2004. Now, why is it that this game is so great to me? Well, I made a whole video about it several years back, but the fact of the matter is, I think the characters are bland, the story is by the numbers, the graphics are ugly since it's set on Mars, and most other aspects about this game I can take or leave, but the Geomod 2.0 technology is so unbelievably fun that it makes every other aspect of the game completely meaningless. Where before you could destroy the terrain, in this case you can destroy any structure, which means you can painstakingly rip apart buildings brick by brick and watch them collapse under their own weight. This is something that no other game has ever been able to recreate, and apparently the physics were largely programmed by a single man, senior programmer Brian Oberkirch. Though while he was responsible largely for building the engine, there were other people alongside him working on the engine as well, such as Luke Schneider. I'm gonna keep that in. Such as a Luke Schneider. Still, the fact they got a full destruction system working on 256 megabytes of RAM can never be overstated. The design philosophy behind switching from the environmental destruction of Geomod 1.0 to the destructible buildings of Geomod 2.0 were laid out by Dan Cermak, VP of Production Development, in a 2009 interview with WorthPlaying.com. We wanted to focus on what we felt was the main part of the gameplay. You can dig a hole and maybe have a trench or a foxhole, but that's not really that important to the gameplay, and what we're trying to do is bring destruction into where it mattered in the game. So that was really the focus, rather than it being a fun little feature. Unfortunately, while the game received critical acclaim, it sold over 1 million copies, which was respectable, but it was not enough to recoup the cost of the game. And as such, things had to be scaled way the hell back for the sequel, Red Faction Armageddon, which unfortunately went back to linear design, which was a big disappointment. Apparently it was so they could program big bombastic set pieces without overloading the processor, but the relentless linearity made the game simply less fun because it took the organic fun of the gameplay and tried to control it, and scripted set pieces simply aren't as fun. Plus, without the freedom of the open world, it also made the destruction feel like a sideshow rather than a meaningful thing. It was honestly a very forgettable sequel to the point where I almost forgot to write about it, and the general public agreed as the game wound up being a financial disappointment. Since Saints Row had proven itself to be the biggest string to Volition's bow, a third game was of course always going to be the next step. And the game ended up coming out on November 15th, 2011. But despite things ending up going very well in the end, things could have turned out very differently. Apparently there was a very high turnover of staff around this time, meaning that by the time Saints Row III was in full swing, only about 1/5 of the 100-person team assembled to work on it actually worked on Saints Row 2. Which might have gone a ways to explain the strangely cynical outlook the development team had on Saints Row 2 leading into the third game. The game's lead designer Scott Phillips said as much in a 2012 interview with Game Sutra. Saints Row 2's design philosophy was put everything into the game, which made for a disjointed title with a varied tone.
What a load of bullshit.
Personally, I found that Saints Row 2 nailed the balance of wacky while still being earnest. Still, this led to the ultimate design of Saints Row III being defined, and that definition was all wacky all the time. And the rule of fun must win out no matter what. For what it's worth, this was something they pulled off relatively well, being similarly critically acclaimed to the second game and having the highest verified sales numbers in the history of Volition, getting up to 5 million units sold. The funny part is, I do remember this game's pre-release, and I remember this game was everywhere. It was marketed up the ass. Personally, while I thought it was the lesser of the two games, I still thought Saints Row III was a tremendous game, and whatever you want to say about the over-the-top nature of the game, it certainly grabbed my attention. I even still have my headphones that came with the special edition version of the game. They're terrible headphones though. They will not work unless they have 2 AAA batteries, and they suck them dry in like 2 hours. This would be the peak of Volition in many ways, not just sales, but it would also be the last time they made something that managed to be fully original and large scale for a number of years. It's actually fitting that it would be the peak, considering it was the last game that Mike Koulos would work on for a while, as he would leave the studio about 6 months before the game launched. Although apparently there was no great reason or controversy for his departure, it was apparently something he was planning on for a while. The next anyone would hear from him would be when he and Matt Toshlog teamed up one more time in the mid-2010s to head Revival Productions, which resulted in Overload, a spiritual sequel to Descent. But Mike's story with Volition wasn't over just yet. Not by a long shot. In the meantime, Dan Cermak, the aforementioned vice president of product development, would end up stepping in to replace Mike, becoming the general manager and president of Volition. But even though Mike Koulos leaving the company didn't have a juicy or controversial reason, this would still be the peak of the company for other reasons. It was also partially down to the financial turmoil that THQ found itself in around this time. Originally, they were developing a DLC for Saints Row III about a ridiculous sci-fi concept that can be summed up by its name, Enter the Dominatrix. But as THQ was on the verge of bankruptcy, they instructed Volition to scale up the concept to a full release, which meant reusing the city of Steelport while putting a twist on the gameplay. This is where the alien invasion and superpowers came from. Unfortunately, THQ did not survive to the end of the game's development, officially declaring bankruptcy about 8 months before it was released, with publishing rights being sold to Deep Silver. Let me be clear, I love Saints Row 4. It's one of the rare games that can make the simple act of getting around thrilling, but there's no doubt in my mind that the game did suffer on account of being forced to abide by these extremely strict and unfortunate scalebacks, but they made it work. After the bankruptcy of THQ, Volition was acquired by Koch Media, now known as Plyon or Playon or whatever the hell. And while Koch Media was noted as being supportive of Volition, it's arguable that the closure of THQ may have unintentionally caused the eventual closure of Volition. It's hard to know to what degree, but it's clear that in the 12 years that Volition and THQ worked together, they developed a good publisher-developer chemistry. It's hard for me to say whether or not the corporate structure of THQ allowed Volition the environment to be able to work efficiently and bring out a consistent amount of products, but the proof is sort of in the pudding when you take a look at the output of Volition Volition before and after, because before THQ went out of business, they were consistently bringing out a game every year or two, whereas between 2013 and 2023, they only brought out 3 games, one of which was a standalone expansion to Saints Row 4. Plus, as I will get into, there was also a significant scaling back as far as the individual game's scope. So there was clearly some sort of X factor between the partnership of Volition and THQ that went out the window. It also didn't help that there were 2 other major factors here that harmed the studio. First of all, they would be battered back and forth between parent companies for the next decade, which ultimately meant they would consistently find themselves in different corporate structures, which is never conducive to a solid workload if you're constantly having to answer to different executive wishes. And second of all, when they were acquired, they were bought alongside the Saints Row license, but Red Faction was sold to a separate company called Nordic Games, a company which sort of picked up the scraps of everything that was left over after the good THQ properties were sold off, including the THQ name itself. So this unfortunately meant that the studio was then relegated to only being the Saints Row studio, which kinda sucked because Saints Row 4 had just pushed its concept to its absolute upper limits to the point where a gat out of hell couldn't really do much to improve on that. It was a game that also reused large portions of the Steelport map from Saints Row the 3rd, mostly unchanged. It was a 4-hour DLC with a story mode that consisted of like 3 cutscenes and somehow took them 2 years to make. After that, there really wasn't anywhere for the series to go, so it was presumed that this was going to be the last one. After which, Volition sort of went into hibernation for a little while as they thought up their next game, which ended up being Agents of Mayhem. And reading into the development of this game, it made it come across like a bit of a dog's breakfast in terms of inspirations and ideas. First of all, it was noted by one of the developers that they sometimes saw more cosplays at conventions of side characters, and so wanted to emphasize a game with a ton of iconic characters. So endeavored to make the main cast as large and diverse as possible. Like Overwatch, just single player. Therefore missing out on the one thing that made Overwatch fun. Apparently in this regard, it was inspired by the likes of League of Legends.
Another fool beast.
Mimia. Welcome to my channel.
There you go. Everything is on sale.
Detach to center egg. Welcome to my channel. Best promotion on Street Ambu.org.
Take it. Thanks for commercial.
Greetings. What do you think?
Right. Get the fuck out of here for that.
Legends and Dota 2, which is an odd inspiration to have when you're making a single-player game. They were also inspired tonally by Saturday morning cartoon shows from the 80s, such as G.I. Joe and He-Man. In fact, game producer Kate Nelson sat down with WCCFtech.com in 2016 and made a point to point out the inspirations. We took inspiration from several places: comic books, animated series, Saturday morning cartoons, movies, and more. Mature G.I. Joe was a phrase heard around the office a lot early on. We knew we wanted players to feel like they had a toy box full of fun action figures at their disposal. We also have injected nods to things like the More You Know PSAs that aired in the 80s in the USA, with each of our agents and villains giving educational advice to players. What in the hell is this game even trying to be? Well, I think the game-playing public sort of agreed with that sentiment, as when the game came out in August of 2017, people were generally confused by the inconsistent tone and presentation, and lamented the other issues with the game, such as a lack of character creator, an embarrassingly small sandbox map, and relentless repetition. It got trashed critically and sold like Apple.
Who's this?
Etienne. You. Even.
The trio come to your aid.
The light cowards! I am with you. Follow. You will be destroyed, Prince. More man hope. Burning hope. Salvation. The forest is with you. The forest and rise with the moon. Fury of the light. Bask in life's essence. Fury of the light.
Meh. Gimmick boss. Gimmick fucking boss. Oh, you're such a trash, Bodek. RNG boss fight. I don't know what killed me. I followed the fucking dreads and I died.
Absolute crap. By the time of 1 year after its release, it managed to sell an abysmal 300,000 copies. The failure of the game led to substantial layoffs within the studio. So let's recap. They spent 3 games in functionally the same sandbox map, and they spent 4 years to develop what would ultimately be a game that any competent developer could have cranked out in half that time, which ended up being an extremely mediocre game that sold poorly. Their one property that they were sure was a hit had been driven into the ground, and they no longer had access to their other major franchise. So what would anybody do in this situation? Well, I guess take another stab at the franchise they were sure was actually good. Unfortunately, this would be the final destination for the studio. After Agents of Mayhem, they spent no less than 5 years making a reboot to the Saints Row series, which came out on August 23rd, 2022. You could be mistaken into thinking there was some hope, given the fact that Mike Koulos actually returned to the studio in January of 2019, but you would be mistaken, especially because the real culprits of the studio's death were already in the picture by that point, as Plyon, or Playon, or whatever the hell, had been acquired by Embracer Group back in 2018, and Embracer Group is going to become a very important member of this story immediately. But I do need to explain something here because it confused the hell out of me. Embracer Group was known as Nordic Games Licensing and later renamed to THQ Nordic. However, they renamed to Embracer Group down the line, but left their game publishing branch as THQ Nordic in an effort to prevent confusion between the parent company and the publishing branch, especially once they started acquiring studios. You see, I never knew that THQ Nordic were part of Embracer. I thought they were acquired by Embracer at some point. In theory, this was a good thing for Volition because it meant they had officially found themselves back under the same umbrella as Red Faction, which in another lifetime would have given them another string to their bow. But that didn't matter after Saints Row 2022. I'ma just cut to the chase. Despite an extremely heavy marketing push, the game-playing public more than likely smelled a rat with the less than stellar presentation and scaled back vision of what fans had come to expect when they saw the Saints Row reboot. As a result, the game sold decently with 1.7 million copies sold, which isn't that far behind the likes of Saints Row 4, but it was still considered a financial failure. mostly because the game took an estimated $100 million to make. What the hell? How could a game like this cost that much? Well, thankfully, we have some hands-on accounts to explain this. This comes from user Mr. Saints Godzilla 21, who had a close relationship with Volition and was able to release a lot of information regarding this game's development. Reading into it, you wouldn't need to be a genius to know that it all comes down to two words.
Oh, fucking idiot.
words: incompetent management. But it's good to know that we have actual sources to back up what was going on behind the scenes. The publishers were apparently very anal and demanding of what they wanted the project to be, and didn't allow Volition the creative freedom to bring the best out of the game. Situations where low-level developers were ambitiously trying to create interesting ideas in the game, but for one reason or another, their voices were overwritten by management, stifling the creativity. Then there was also some pretty notable petty squabbles between upper management and low-level developers, leading to stifling situations, such as script writers not being able to attend recording sessions, leading to a story presentation that felt disjointed and confused. Then there was the engine, which was a modified version of which had become clunky and outdated, forcing a lot of limitations on what they were able to do. All of this led to a toxic soup of creative stiflement and constant setbacks that came with increases to the budget to compensate for all the setbacks. This led to the game costing $100 million and taking 5 years to make, all for what was obviously a mediocre product. Plus, it also didn't help that the social media team, for whatever baffling reason, decided to roast people on social media for voicing their complaints, which really didn't help. That right there is about as much of biting the hand that feeds you as you could possibly get. Ultimately, management made the company go all in on a pair of fours because management was convinced it was a four of a kind. It didn't work out for them, losing them millions of dollars in the process. You could sort of get the sense that things were heading in a bad direction after that, but the company didn't close immediately. They would spend the next year working on DLC, and their ownership would even transfer from Deep Silver to Gearbox, for whatever that was worth, because in August of 2023, Embracer Group announced that Volition would effectively immediately be closing its doors. A 30-year history found its way to a disappointing end. So the same question as always, what happened? Well, here's the thing. Originally, my conclusion on the matter was about them making subpar products and then making fun of the fans for not enjoying it. My conclusion on the matter was don't bite the hand that feeds you, especially because they had spent a decade bringing out mostly nothing. And when they did bring something out, it was largely mediocre. This was absolutely part of the problem, because if you're not bringing out good games, chances are audiences are going to lose faith in you and you're not going to get very many sales from it. But there's also another factor here that contributed to the death of Volition, possibly more than anything. And that is the parent company Embracer Group gambling and failing. Not on the Saints Row reboot, but something completely different. By the time of 2022, Embracer Group was a massive company and remains so to this day. Their assets in the gaming industry include CDE Entertainment, Gearbox, Deep Silver, etc., with all these companies also owning individual video game companies beneath them, so the continued existence of a lot of video game developers relies on big money coming from up top. And there was supposed to be a lot of money coming from up top, as Embracer Group was in the midst of a $1 billion investment deal from a Saudi Arabian investor conglomerate called Savvy Games Group. A bit of a recurring theme in the modern history of business generally, various businesses attempting to get a bite of the Saudi Arabian oil money apple. This is regardless of the ethics involved. This was a deal that was in the works for a while. Talks began in 2022 with a $1 billion investment as a starting point, with negotiations eventually reaching in excess of $2 billion. And as it turns out, Embracer Group, as a means to make the deal more palatable, went out of their way to artificially inflate their value. They did this by spending tons of money on expensive projects. Aside from starting numerous expensive projects, they also went on a buying spree of various developers and publishers, really trying to sell this company as something worth investing in, as a means to negotiate a higher money deal, taking on a lot of debt in the process. But as it turns out, Embracer Group shot their load a bit too early, and having spent hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, to expand their value, it turns out they were a bit hasty, and in May of 2023, Savvy Games Group pulled out of the deal at the 11th hour, as they had yet to get the deal in writing. Suddenly, billions of dollars slipped through their fingers, which meant that Embracer Group was left to foot the bill for all these acquisitions and expensive projects, meaning they were immediately in millions, if not billions of dollars worth of bad debt.
Wer für Koba
Brother. Oh my god. Watch for friendly fire. I wanted to do this solo, guys. Guys, can you just stay here? Thank you. Sure. Nice. You killed him real nice.
Anfrage bestätigt. Verstärkung wurde losgeschickt. Verstanden. Pelikan 1 versucht erneute Abholung aus Evakuierungszone. Wir benötigen ein Geschütz. Bitte Geschütz. Ankunftszeit 1 Minute 30 Sekunden.
Sie haben viele Proben gesichert. Gut gemacht. Herr Dive, schön, Sie an Bord zu haben.
Initiiere FTL-Sprung nach das Mentorio-System. Sprung abgeschlossen. Missionskoordinaten festgelegt. Hellports bereit. Helldivers zu den Hellports. Wiederhole. Helldivers zu den Hellports.
Wie wär's hier? Hier?
Start initiiert.
Vorräte. Fordere Verstärkung an!
Anfrage bestätigt. Verstärkung im Anmarsch. Essentielle Taktikausrüstung verfügbar.
Verstärkung! Fordere Ausrüstung für Ziel an!
Anfrage bestätigt. Verstärkung wurde losgeschickt. Noch 10 Minuten für die Mission.
Gerade nach! Paket gefunden! Lege Paket ab! Vorräte! Ich bin am Terminal! Fordere Verstärkung an!
Anfrage bestätigt.
Wir
Verstärkung ist
benötigen ein
unterwegs.
Geschütz! Wer? Nördlich, in der Nähe. Er bitte Geschütz! Vielen Dank!
Ziel abgeschlossen.
Markiere Karte, östlich, 100 Meter. Probe gesammelt! Letzte Probe gesammelt! Landungsschiffe! Positioniere Pin, südwestlich, 100 Meter. Ziel lokalisiert, südlich. Hier nach! Werfen! Entdeckung! Fühlt sich gut an! Auf eine Probe!
Markiere Karte. Westlich. 200 Meter. Verstanden. Wir benötigen...
Geschütz unterwegs.
Bitte geschützt!
Noch 5 Minuten. Wir können nicht mehr lange hier bleiben, Herr Diver.
Wie wär's mit einem Haken? Freiheit!
No super scientist.
Entdeckung! Werfen Granate! Wie wär's mit einem Haken? Freiheit!
Die Freiheit schreitet voran. Danke Ihnen. Sie können jetzt evakuieren.
Seht ihr das? Die Besten der Besten.
Lade neu!
Evakuierung verfügbar.
Positioniere Pins. Westlich. 100 Meter. Fordere Unterstützungswaffe an! Bitte, Fahrzeug! Wir benötigen ein Geschütz! Ja, bitte Geschütz! Kürzt ein wenig Demokratie! Markiere Karte. Nordwestlich. 100 Meter.
Gewehrziel in der Nähe. Koordinaten empfangen. Pelikan 1 kehrt zum Evakuierungsbereich zurück.
Positioniere Pins. Westlich. Weit weg.
Ankunftszeit T-1 Minute 30 Sekunden. Ankunftszeit T-1 Minute.
Good luck, gentlemen.
Pelikan 1 macht sich zur Landung bereit. Countdown läuft. Bereit machen zum Abflug. Evakuierung abgeschlossen. Pelikan 1 Diese Stadt wird bald wieder ein Leuchtfeuer der Freiheit sein.
Willkommen an Bord, Herr Diver.
Piu, 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 piu.
Triumphale Rückkehr.
You just don't die. He left. Que precisão, fine.
This meant sudden shrinkage, the likes of which sub-zero temperatures couldn't manage. They had to retract and retract hard. So they canceled a bunch of projects and started closing studios. They laid off a grand total of roughly 4,500 employees, which is somehow not even that big of a number at this point. And apparently 44 studios were affected, some of which were able to continue after some restructuring, but several were sold off, and the unlucky ones were closed altogether. Gearbox was sold, Saber Interactive and several subsidiaries were sold, and of the studios that were closed, this included Free Radical Design, New World Interactive, Rainbow Studios, and of course, the very first one to go was Volition. An unfortunate end as a result of private investment gone wrong. Unfortunately, Volition was probably the easiest cast-off to officially close down, because they had been in trouble for years. 3 games in a decade, one of which was a standalone expansion, one of which was a crappy sandbox game, and one which was a $100 million disaster. With that said, originally there was a part of me that wanted to at least partially blame Volition for this. I don't think that can really be said anymore, because there's only so much you can actually blame on Volition itself when you hear verified stories of publisher interference and dick measuring contests. How can you expect your team to make something good when management is as incompetent as this? And once you hear stories of developer interference for things like Saints Row, how can you not start assuming that the situations were similar with things like Agents of Mayhem? I've never heard any specific issues creatively, but I do know that Agents of Mayhem at least had verified sources confirming budget cuts. Sure, the company was far removed from what it once was back when it was making groundbreaking physics engines and giving GTA a run for its money, but they still had the capabilities of being a solid company. So at that point, it's hard not to pin everything solely on the publishers, or at least it's a 90-10 split. Sure, you can argue about Volition going after fans on social media as playing a part, but that's drops in the bucket compared to what else happened. So in the end, I think it's fair to say that the fall of THQ inadvertently caused the fall of Volition, because clearly there was a chemistry and creative freedom that Volition got from THQ, and other corporate structures seemingly did nothing but stifle them. Unfortunately, it's a tale as old as time in the gaming industry. You get bought out, then mismanaged to death. And sometimes they don't even get mismanaged to death. Sometimes they get shut down just to give a short-term boost to stock prices. In fact, I'm hoping we're starting to see a shift in the overall industry, because it wasn't that long ago that being bought out by a large publisher was seen as a good thing, because it meant you had more financial security and more resources. But we're seeing more and more these days that companies can be faced with closure no matter what. Whether a game flops or succeeds, it's no guarantee of security anymore, all because of stock prices and private equity. And that's resulted in countless jobs being lost, and I hope that this results in studios opting not to be acquired anymore. Hopefully studios will choose to remain independent forever instead of taking the money, because while independence means less financial security, at least it means if the studio closes down, it's because of a failed product, and not because someone wants to artificially inflate the value of their 401k by 12 cents. Perhaps the lessons learned over the past couple of years will result in a better industry long term. One can hope. And hopefully every single member of Volition landed on their feet once it was all said and done. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, subscribe, hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing, and leave a comment telling me what you think. Also hit the hype button, I guess. A big thank you to the Bacon Brigade for always being there for me, and I will see y'all next time. Stay crispy, my friends. so hot right now.
Alright. We'll have to watch Spiff and Brit. What is this? Age of War? Oh, it's a Flash game. Yeah, I used to play a lot of Flash games. Because my parents' laptop was really bad. It was terrible. Yeah. The game was goated. Okay, let's see it. What's this about?
Do you remember Age of War?
No.
I do. This is my favorite Flash game, and chances are you fall into one of two categories. Number one, this is also your favorite Flash game, or category two, you weren't even alive when it first came out
Holy
in 2007.
shit,
For everyone in category
2007.
one, I'm sorry for mentally aging you by 200 years. Anyway, this is a surprisingly simple
19
game.
years
You have
old
a
now.
base, the enemy has a base, and you throw units at each other until one side
Okay.
loses. There are special abilities and different units tied to different ages. It's a great game. However, there is one aspect of this game that has eluded me my entire life, and so today I've
Are you gonna
decided to
break it,
return
sir?
and set things straight. The impossible mode difficulty was, for an entire generation of
Impossible.
gamers, impossible. There are forums dedicated to trying to decode the actual part.
Hello, Raider. Howdy. Hello, Raider.
Hello.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, hello.
Howdy!
Anybody needs a free blueprint? I got a augment blueprint.
Hey, hello!
There are 2 blueprints in the lower floor if anybody wants it.
Hey, hello!
There are two blueprints in the ground level. Augment blueprint and a grip, if you really want it.
Howdy! Hello, Raider!
Hello.
Let's head home at the control hatch.
Is en route. The safe window is closing. You have 10 minutes to return to Speranza. I repeat, 10 minutes.
Hello.
Hello? Howdy!
Still here, still.
Na 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 na. Pretty good. I don't know. Might take a nap.